I want to talk about the theme of hallucination in architecture. Sorry, I'm still getting some background voices. Can you mute the other sounds? Thank you. And I want to today to share some thoughts that come from a book that I'm working on at the moment. A book that is kind of related to the title of this session, Architecture in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. It's a book that's, the manuscript is written, but hasn't been published yet. It'll be published in about 5 or 6 months' time by Bloomsbury Publishing in London. And it's the first part of a 2-volume edition looking at both the positive and negative aspects of AI. But today I'm going to talk about the positive aspects of AI. And in particular, I want to think about how AI can help us understand how we as human beings think and how we design. The question I want to really, the background question is, can AI be creative? Which of course is a big, big question. AI is not conscious. Machines are not conscious. Therefore, from a certain technical point of view, we can't assume that they are creative, but they can certainly generate things. But my starting point would be this kind of the comment that the Japanese computational architect Makoto Watanabe makes about comparing machines to human beings. Machines are better than people at solving complex problems with many intertwined conditions. In that realm, people are no match for machines, but people are the only ones who can create an image that does not yet exist. Machines do not have dreams. To my mind, this is somewhat old-fashioned thinking that we know already that AI that can produce images that do not exist. I mean, the simple example of generative adversarial networks, GANs, that can hallucinate a lot of images shows us what it can do. These are all faces that are hallucinated by AI. In other words, these are not real faces. They're not faces of real people. These people do not exist. In other words, already we're seeing that AI can produce something, can create an image that does not already exist. This is an example of what is called style GANs, one of the more refined versions of GANs. And we're already seeing in architecture a kind of similar approach whereby one can hallucinate buildings that do not already exist. This is an example of the work of ex-Cool, Wan Yuhe, who was based in Shenzhen. And these are hallucinated images, it's a video in fact, of buildings that do not exist. It's based on a database of clearly modernist buildings, modernist designs, and the AI is quite capable of producing of novel forms, novel designs for buildings that do not yet exist. To some extent, some of the details in these images are a little bit unrefined, but things are improving and we'll soon be at the point where we can generate things in a very interesting way. I want to show you also the work of Daniel Bolajan, who is a professor at Florida Atlantic University and also collaborates with Corp Himmelblau. Just recently, he has produced a project called Deep Himmelblau, which is, again, hallucination using cycle GANs, another version of GANs, an hallucination of buildings based on a data set of existing Corp Himmelblau buildings. And what we're finding now is a number of progressive practices in architecture are using these techniques to begin to hallucinate possible forms of buildings and to use it in the design process. This is the very latest work that's come out from Corp Himmelblau. It was released by Wolf Prix in July for our Digital Futures conference, where in discussion with Tom Main, he was showing the latest work that comes out of the office. This is very exciting work, in my opinion. It's the very cutting edge of what architecture can do in terms of the use of AI to generate buildings. So, but I want to use this occasion today to ask the question, what is creativity? It's one of the most difficult questions in neuroscience itself. Often the comparison is made between human intelligence and artificial intelligence, and the argument is that artificial intelligence does not have consciousness, therefore it cannot be equated with human intelligence. At the same time, we don't really know what consciousness is. It's still mysterious. So until such time as we can understand what consciousness is, we will never be able to replicate it in a machine. But according to some neuroscientists, an even bigger, an even harder question is, what is creativity? It is one of these kind of impossible questions to answer, and I'm not going to be able to answer it now. All I want to do, though, is to question some of the received assumptions about the nature of creativity. I'm showing you here Margaret Bowden, the grand old lady of AI from the University of Sussex in England, who has written about AI and creativity. And at the moment, her interpretation about creativity stands. Now, I don't have any disrespect for Margaret Bowden. I think she's a wonderful individual, but I want to question whether her approach towards creativity is the most productive one. For example, she has a series of categories. I won't go into these categories, but she describes a series of categories about AI: combinatorial creativity, exploratory creativity, transformational creativity, whereby she analyzes the creative output and categorizes them according to this particular category. This is her way of defining what forms of creativity we have. I want to question, though, whether we shouldn't really focusing less on the creative output and more, as designers, trying to think what is the creative impulse itself, and trying to see if we can connect it with the very first moment, with the gaze itself, the architectural gaze. Can the gaze be creative? And if the gaze can be creative, how do we understand it? I'm not going to be able to answer these questions, but I want to ask some important questions. So the theme is the notion of hallucinating architecture, the idea that somehow architecture is, we can understand the way that we generate architecture in relation to the way that AI hallucinates also. I want to just mention briefly the work of Anil Seth, a computational neuroscientist who also was part of the Digital Futures event. This is one of the most amazing TED Talks you will see. As you can see on at the bottom here, at the bottom right, there are 10 million views. I mean, it is really a very inspirational TED Talk. And I will just show you a few kind of stills from this TED Talk to outline the ideas that I want to take. What I want to sort of take from Anil Seth is the notion that we as human beings are continually hallucinating the world. And the central thesis that Anil Seth puts forward is the idea that perception is itself a form of controlled hallucination. Perception is a form of controlled hallucination. And in this TED Talk, he outlines, and I won't show the details of it, he outlines how you can see perception as being a form of controlled hallucination. The standard understanding of how we perceive the world is that we just simply record the world. The world is out there and we absorb it, a bit like a camcorder or something. We are just simply absorbing the world and we see it as it is. What Anil Seth is saying is actually what's really happening is that we are also using our own creativity to try and interpret what the world has to offer. In other words, the brain is locked into this kind of bony skull. It doesn't see anything. The brain does not see anything. All it gets is electrical impulses from the world outside, and it's trying to interpret what it's seeing. It's trying to interpret it based on what it already knows. So in other words, we look at the world is out there, but we creatively interpret the world through our imagination, through a kind of a form of what Anil Seth calls controlled hallucination. If hallucination is a kind of uncontrolled perception, then perception right here and right now is a kind of hallucination, but a controlled hallucination. Now, this is a thesis that I wanted to kind of take up and develop. And the term, of course, hallucination is being used for AI and also here for human beings. And I want to kind of compare this to another view. Anil Seth, as a neuroscientist, is very skeptical about psychoanalysis, but I would also compare some of the views of Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian psychoanalytic theorist and philosopher, who takes the Lacanian view. And the Lacanian view broadly is to say that we don't actually engage with reality except in certain moments. What we take for reality is in fact filtered through our imagination. In a way, fantasy is an important part of how we understand the world. Fantasy becomes the lens through which we see reality. Instead of seeing fantasy on one hand and reality on the other as two opposites, actually, we see reality through the lens of fantasy. So here's a quote from Zizek from one of the books I published a while back. Far from being a kind of fragment of our dreams that prevents us from seeing reality as it effectively is, fantasy is constitutive of what we call reality. The most common bodily reality is constituted via a detour through the maze of the imagination. In other words, our imagination becomes a filter by which we understand with reality. Reality, we see it through the lens of fantasy, it is filtered, and we interpret it much in the way that Anil Seth is talking about. The ultimate lesson of virtual reality is the virtualization of the very true reality. Another way of thinking about that is that the lesson of virtual reality is not how virtual reality is, but rather how virtual our understanding of reality itself is. That's to say that we see the world through a certain lens. We see the world through a kind of lens of what we know already and how we've been trained to see the world. Now, of course, AI, neural networks are trained. And I want to argue basically that we also as humans are trained. Well, of course, we know that in many ways, but I want to illustrate this through a series of examples. Now, if you ask any child to draw a rainbow, they'll come up with something like this. They'll draw 7 colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Because that is the way that we are trained, that is the way we are constructed to understand what a rainbow is. Every single child at every single school all over the world is told that there are 7 colors in a rainbow, and that's how they present the rainbow in their drawings, because that's how they understand the rainbow is. Of course, when we look at an actual rainbow, we'll see there's an infinite spectrum of different colors in a rainbow. There aren't just 7 colors, but we have been trained to think that there are 7 colors in a rainbow. The same goes for architecture. This is a classic example, the Villa Savoye by Le Corbusier, a classic example of what we call functionalist architecture. Now, it's a building on pilotis with a flat roof. If you come from my country, from the UK, you'll know that flat roofs are not very functional because it rains a lot in the UK, as it has been in Shanghai in the last few weeks. It rains a lot, and there's nothing functional about a flat roof because a flat roof leaks. But nonetheless, we have been trained to think this is a piece of functionalist architecture. Now, I want to take this is an example of, I'm trying to argue by way of analogy here, and I want to show you an example of some fabulous work by the AI-based artist Memo Akten, M-E-M-O, Memo Akten, A-K-T-E-N. Memo Akten is an artist who has produced a series of studies, one could call them experiments, as it were, on how we see the world. And in this video, which I'll show you in a moment, what you'll see is that on the left-hand side, that's Memo's hands, that's a cloth. And on the right-hand side, you're going to see how this image on the left is seen through a certain filter. Now, there are 3 different filters in this video. One, as you can see already, is a filter that has, it's a neural network trained on images of the ocean. So what it does, it looks at the image on the left-hand side, sees this bit of cloth of these hands, and starts interpreting it as the ocean. It goes on to look at how it is also, there's another sequence which shows a neural network trained on fire, and also thirdly, a series of a neural network that is trained on flowers. So let me just show you this video, which is astonishing because it gives you a sense of how you can see the world through a set of filters based on how you have been trained to see the world. So that shows us how AI could be trained to see the world in a certain way, to hallucinate the world in a certain way. And I've already argued that Anil Seth has been saying that we are trained to see the world through a form of controlled hallucination. Now, I want to show you now an example of an architectural example of something very similar to that, an example by one of my students from FIU, Fernando Salcedo, who did a similar study whereby on the left-hand side, you can see the wardrobe, Fernando's wardrobe. You can see T-shirts, you can see ties, and so on. On the right-hand side, you've got two separate neural networks that have been trained, or they've been trained on two separate sets of data. One is going to be the data that's based on a design for a research center in UAE, United Arab Emirates, by Zaha Hadid architects. Another one is just generic buildings in downtown Miami. And what's happening basically is the image on the left-hand side of Fernando's wardrobe, of his T-shirt, of his tie, and so on, starts getting translated into forms of architecture. So here we go. Okay, I want to refer to this kind of principle. So the argument basically is if the gaze is connected to creativity, then creativity must itself be connected to the gaze itself. And for that very moment at which we started gazing out on the world itself, there is a kind of we are drawing inspiration from that world, and we are seeing the world through a kind of certain lens. The term I'm using for this is a term called architecturalization. It's not a very attractive term. It's a kind of seemingly banal term, but I think it's an interesting term if we really push it further. I once had a discussion with Bernard Schumi, who was the dean of Columbia University at the time, about how architects look at the world. And we both agreed that architects looked at the world through a certain architectural lens. In other words, to be an architect was almost to have a certain gaze, to think about, to have a certain sensibility towards the world, to see the world through a certain kind of lens. Now I'm showing you here the sketch that Jorn Utzon did for the initial sketch for the Sydney Opera House in Australia. Of course, the building itself transpired to be slightly different from that, but this was the initial sketch, and it was inspired by the image on the right-hand side, the sails of yachts in the harbour of Sydney. What effectively Jorn Utzon is doing is, in a sense, taking that and architecturizing it, and imagining those forms as architectural vaults of an opera house. And one can see this also in the way that a lot of architects begin to take concepts and translate those concepts directly into architectural form. For example, Gilles Deleuze, the French philosopher, wrote a book on the fold that proved to be very influential. Now, what Deleuze was referring to was nothing about form. He was referring to ways of thinking about what folded ways of thinking, but architects automatically took that idea of the fold and translated it into an architectural form. And they thought, okay, and so on the left-hand side is an issue of architectural design edited by Greg Lind, where they're all kind of being inspired by Deleuze and talking about folding in architecture as though Gilles Deleuze was referring to architecture itself. We can see similar things going on coming out of the Barton at the moment in University College London. On the left-hand side, the discrete. Gilles Redsin understands that the digital is discrete, and then translate that into architectural form, as though the fact that the digital is discrete somehow means that we have to have a series of discrete elements in our architecture. Similarly, Mario Carpo looks at the question of big data, and he reads that big data is messy. It's no longer sort of smooth, that's messy. Therefore, he sort of interprets that the 3D printed chair on the right-hand side as an example of big data, of kind of messy architecture. What big data has to do with form is another question completely. To my mind, big data is about information. It's about how you process information. It's not about form itself. It's about how you use Uber, how you use Didi, and so on. It's about a different way of thinking. But architects have this way of trying to think about the world through the lens of through a kind of architecturalized lens. The classic example, of course, is the work of Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher. Jacques Derrida invented the term deconstruction, and architects automatically began to assume that he was referring to architecture because the word deconstruction was in there. And that led to a series of misunderstandings about what Derrida was referring to. In fact, Derrida was talking about how we are constructed socially, constructed culturally, how we see the world, actually much like AI, with certain biases. In his term, it was all about how you had in the binary oppositions by which we see the world, one term was privileged over another, therefore our view of the world was biased. And what he was arguing was that the way we see the world needs to be dismantled. We need to get rid of all those biases, all those privileged hierarchies, and see the world for what it is. In other words, architecture for him was a metaphor, and he was talking about how we need to get rid of all this kind of this constructed way of seeing the world and try and dig down to a solid foundation from which we could build our argument. Architects saw the term construction and immediately thought, okay, he's talking about architecture, and so on and so on. So what the argument here is simply one of analogy. I'm not proving anything. I'm simply kind of saying that maybe that world of AI out there can help us understand how we as humans think. It can become a mirror in which we can understand how the world operates. And this is a quote from the Japanese roboticist, Hiroshi Ishiguro. The robot is a kind of mirror that reflects humanity, and by creating intelligent robots, we can open up new opportunities to contemplate what it means to be human. I would argue that we can use AI precisely as that kind of mirror, and by hallucinating AI, we can use that opportunity to contemplate what it is for humans to be creative. This is ongoing research that is very much still going. I'm going to finish off with a short video, again by Daniel Bolojan, of the Sagrada Familia. This is a cycle GAN that plays off a walk through the forest with the world, the interior of the Sagrada Familia. The world of AI to my mind, is one of the most exciting areas of development in recent times. Thanks to GANs, thanks to new developments, we are now beginning to hallucinate architecture, and that itself is something very special. It's creating a new form, it's creating a new language of architecture, and so on and so on and so on. But more importantly, it's opening up questions about what it is to be human. What is human intelligence? And what is creativity? I'm going to leave it there, right there. Thank you very much. Shishe.